Our first panel is entitled Lessons from the European Experience, Is Austerity a Viable Approach for the U.S. Economic Situation? And as I mentioned, as we approach issues like sequestration, looking at our continuing budget deficit that we run in Washington, I think that there'll be many hard choices and decisions that will have to be made in the future. And the purpose of this panel is just to discuss what some of those decisions are and to try and get some perspective as to what we can learn, if anything, from the European experience. Our first speaker is Dr. Tim Kane, who's chief economist at the Hudson Institute. Kane's research on entrepreneurship and job creation has been widely cited, notably in the 2011 Economic Report of the President. He has served in multiple executive and scholarly roles at think tanks and universities. Kane's most recent book, Bleeding Talent, explores entrepreneurial leadership in the U.S. military.
Thanks, Christian. Well, good morning. I don't know which joke I should start with. One I remember, I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, and I'd mentioned this last night, so forgive me if some of you have heard it, but I was on the debate team. And actually, we had a debate last night, Clay and I, and can I tell him I won? So, yeah, anyway. I used to come out to the University of Utah about once a semester as a cadet on the debate team to debate here, and it's really, really fun to be back at the university. And Christian, I can't thank you enough for giving me this opportunity. When I was a cadet at Air Force, we thought a lot about what communism meant. You know, that was the big economic question of the time. And there were some, jokes that we used to tell, and frankly, there were jokes that the Soviet citizens themselves would tell about how things would work. In fact, Ronald Reagan would like to tell a story about how a commissar from Moscow was out in one of the villages and talked to the local mayor and asked, how was the harvest? How was the potato harvest? And the mayor said, "Oh, commissar, it's been a wonderful harvest. We've got so many potatoes stacked up. They reach up and they tickle the toes of God." And the commissar said, "Well, this is Soviet Marxist. We don't believe in God. There is no God." And he goes, "Oh, that's okay, commissar. There are no potatoes either." So I think of that often when we talk about interest rates, how low interest rates, how low is the price of money, because the Soviets were very proud that bread in America was so expensive, but bread, a loaf of bread in the Soviet Union was 1 ruble. And so, on a tour, Reagan asked to go to the grocery, and he noticed there was no bread, and he pointed it out to his host. And they said, "Yeah, but it only costs 1 ruble." So, having money with a very low cost, it sounds great if you can get access to it. And we're all celebrating how low interest rates are right now in the U.S., but are they really low if you're a small business person and you go to a bank and the bank for you doesn't have any money? That's a real question I think will become even more pressing in the years ahead. But today we're going to talk about Europe, and it's a really neat opportunity. I'm writing a book with Glenn Hubbard. In fact, the edits to this are due in 2 days, and the book will be published in June. And we have a chapter in this book about great power and how it declines. We have a chapter on ancient Rome, how it declined. We have a chapter on Ming China and on Imperial Britain, one on Imperial Spain. But we also have a chapter on the EU and trying to analyze what's happening there and maybe what mistakes they're making that have been made in the past. And we have a chapter on the United States as well. But I'll focus on some of the things that we've observed about Europe. So this is a screenshot from my computer this morning. And we're witnessing in our time, as Dr. Alexander pointed out, a really scary amount of unemployment in Europe. Over 25% in Spain. Now that's analogous to a 25% unemployment rate in the U.S. at the peak of the Great Depression. So there is a Great Depression in many countries in Europe. But EU overall, this story in the New York Times says it's now hit a peak. And I don't think this is the last record that will be set. My guess is next month there'll be an even deeper crisis. So there's something very real and very scary happening in Europe. It's our biggest trading partner, so it will be affecting us as well. But The crisis in unemployment, and this is, I think, where I'll try to present something new for us all to remember. The crisis in unemployment isn't just about what's happened since 2008. There has been a crisis in Europe preceding the EU and preceding the Eurozone. So here is another screenshot from Google data that shows the unemployment rate in 3 European countries. So Spain is peaking, and it's scary, but you know what? They had a 20% or about a 22% unemployment rate back in, what was that, 1994, 93. The southern European economies have been wrestling with unemployment. So there's been something very broken inside their, what we call their supermodel. You know, an economic model is on a piece of paper. A supermodel is something that's real and in the flesh. The Spanish supermodel, how it actually operates, has not been healthy. Now, it looked healthy for a while during this time when it joined the Eurozone, but I would argue that that was a momentary illusion that we're coming out of. Now, Sweden, the United Kingdom, quite in contrast, they've got healthy supermodels. Here's a really good perspective, though, on when we think about the world economy and we want to compare different countries. This compares GDP per capita, the productivity of the workforces of a handful of different countries. The US has really set the bar for a century now on being productive, and other countries have lagged behind. Some, like China and India, which are the lower two here, we hear about them in the news because they're growing very quickly. But again, the metaphor is my 6-year-old daughter is growing very quickly. I don't see her as a threat quite yet. When she hits 15, that's going to be different. But look at the European economies. In fact, let me flip to the next slide, because how we really want to understand growth in countries that aren't operating at the frontier is how they're approaching the country at the frontier. So this is relative GDP per capita from 1950 to about 2010. The European countries are clustered at about 80%, right? So to be operating at the frontier, you need to invent everything new. You want to be more productive next year than you are right now, you need to invent something new. So how many people have iPhones in the audience, right? That makes us more productive. That's something that Apple has been revolutionizing, and you know, other countries operate at some parts of the frontier. So I'd say South Korea, Japan are part of that revolution, and Samsung. But then if you switch to, say, a different sector, agricultural technology, we're probably pioneering there in ways that other countries are, few other countries are participating. So the US operates at all these frontiers. On average, the productivity of these other countries, including Japan, looked like they were going to surpass us, and they didn't. So most other economies, I think epitomized by Japan, aren't entrepreneurial. They're not innovative on a broad scale. They tend to be very much big bank, big business, and not nearly as innovative there. Some other countries are catching up, but you can see there's some Latin America in here where they've been languishing at the 20% level, and Spain is not included in here. But this is what Glenn and I, we try to make the point that there's not one European model. There are really 3. There's a Nordic model or a northern model, which is operating very close to the frontier. There's a core model made up of countries like Germany and the United Kingdom, which is operating around that 80% level. The crisis is in Southern Europe, which looked like it was growing. So from about 1950 to 1980, I think the question was, wow, what is Southern Europe doing right? What can we learn from Southern Europe? It's what you see in newspapers now. Look how fast China's growing. What can we learn from China? And I would submit to you, we have nothing to learn from China, right? I don't have any nutrition facts to learn from my 6-year-old daughter. I'm happy that they're growing. I think it's wonderful, but we shouldn't mistake thinking that our supermodel in the US is somehow broken because another country grows faster. You want to look at the relative level of GDP per capita. What's sad about Southern European economies is they've been stuck at that level, that they're not entrepreneurial, and they need to be. They need to enrich their people. They need to think about how their model is broken and why it's not operating at a higher level. So here's what the illusion has been. This is a chart, and if there's one chart to remember, I think it's this one. There's been this illusion that because the EU and the Eurozone were created, that all these countries had exactly the same risk profile. So this is a measure of different interest rates paid on different sovereign debt notes. And you know, for The pre-Euro era, they were treated really differently. There were a few countries that were just higher risk profiles. Greece is the outlier that has the highest. And then right when the euro is introduced, there's a time where they converged, the euro is introduced, and the markets, the international markets assume, and I think one of the great events of historical idiocy, that Greek debt is exactly as risky as German debt or British debt. And for 6 years it operated like that. And then suddenly these economies broke down. Now what does that mean operationally? It means that you've got Spain or Greece whose economies aren't healthy, but can go out suddenly and borrow on the international markets huge amounts of money to inflate their economies, to imagine that they're rich, to institute lots of fiscal expenditures at what looks like very low costs. That illusion broke a few years ago. Now I think that's an incredibly healthy evolutionary step in the Eurozone. Now here in the United States, we hear these comparisons that Europe is trying to be maybe a little bit more like the US. Believe me, buying California debt is not risk-free, and the markets don't think so. They don't think buying California debt or Illinois debt or Michigan debt is the same as buying Virginia debt or Utah debt. And more importantly, when one of those countries faces troubles, they can't run to the United States government for a bailout fund. So it's a little confusing to me to understand why there might be a Euro bailout fund and say we need to be more like America. We really don't do that here. And I don't think it's necessarily healthy for the European sovereign states to be able to get bailed out by their central government. But I'm not an expert in this area. This is just what I've noticed. And I do think at least whatever happens going forward, the international markets won't make this mistake again. So a good important step. I hope the EU stays together. I hope that trading area stays together. And I think Kern is exactly right. That's trade and immigration flows are the key to real strength. But what are the European economies doing wrong? That's the last slide I have for you. I would say look at their economic freedom scores. So if we can go back here, I'm sorry. Yeah, if we can go back here, there's a measure of economic freedom done by the Wall Street Journal and the Heritage Foundation. For a year, I ran that project. The World Bank has a similar rating system called its Doing Business Index. How easy is it to do business in different countries? For example, you want to start a business here in Utah. How many forms do you have to fill out? The less you have to fill out and the fewer days you have to wait to get approval, that means you're a freer economy. So in the Soviet Union, if you wanted to start a business, you might have to fill out 20 forms, which means you'd have to pay off 20 bureaucrats to get approval. So corruption is correlated with how thick your bureaucracy is. The economic freedom of these different countries, guess what? It's highest in the Nordic countries, it's less high in the core countries, and it's weakest in the Southern European economies. In Spain, that high unemployment rate, where does that come from? It's not a financial crisis. It's almost impossible to fire someone if you're a Spanish company and you have a Spanish workforce. They make it very expensive and very difficult. You can be subject to lawsuits. Here in the United States, we don't think about that. It's easy to lay off someone if you need to. If it's that hard to fire a person or lay off a person in Spain, guess what? They don't hire in the first place. So there's been a youth unemployment crisis in the Southern European economies where they supposedly have the best worker protections, but they're not really protecting workers. They're protecting existing workers and they're punishing young workers. That's the crisis. It's an institutional regulatory crisis that's being mistaken for a financial crisis. So I think it'll be resolved positively, but I think it'll be a tough decade. So again, thanks for letting me be here and set the table on what's wrong with Europe.